Thank you. Thank you, Rich. I'm afraid I have to tell you that I have actually negotiated a slight extension on the 8 minutes for some off-balance sheet payments. Now, this is called the Ideas Exchange, so I should probably preface my comments by saying that many of the things I'm going to say are, unsurprisingly, incredibly simplistic and most definitely prejudiced and biased. There's no other way you could cover a topic like this in this kind of time frame without making some simplifications. But the starting point, let me just click to the slide. The starting point for this talk is the financial crisis, because the financial crisis is something that's very recent, and it's something which is still very much, I would say, still with us. But the broad sweep of what I'm going to try to talk about over the next few minutes is really more of a historical critique of capitalism. And by capitalism, of course, I mean the way in which we currently run our economy, the idea that people can, that private individuals and companies can actually own property and assets, and that we can buy and sell things on free markets, as opposed to a system whereby the state controls everything. So I want to try and attempt a critique of capitalism, and my fundamental conclusion is that capitalism contains the seeds of its own destruction. And I would say it contains the seeds of its own destruction in many ways because of the moral and philosophical circumstances around its very creation back in the 18th century. If you will, capitalism was born into a state of original sin, if you want to put it in incredibly crazy terminology. But what I'll do is I'll start with the financial crisis. Well, I want to talk about two cycles in the Western world's history where there's been a massive wave of capitalist expansion, followed in both cases by an unholy explosion when it all went horribly wrong. And I want to use these two examples through history to outline why I would conclude with the insights that I've already really shared with you. So, starting point is the financial crisis of 2007, 2009. Not everybody here will remember the crisis, but everybody here would have been alive when it happened. It was a horrendous time for the global economy, and really for anybody who had a clue what the hell was going on. I mean, a whole range of banks collapsed. Roughly $8 trillion, that's $8,000 billion, was wiped off the value of the stock markets in the United States. Now, $8 trillion is roughly 3 times the size of the national income in the UK. It's a lot of money. But looking at the detonator switch there, and I was there when this happened, in the financial markets, back in October 2008, the financial system had literally minutes worth of cash in its ATM networks, in the cash point machines. The G20 government ended up backstopping the financial markets with roughly $20 trillion of money and commitments and guarantees. Now, $20 trillion, to put this in perspective, is roughly the annual domestic product of the world's largest economy, the United States. It's a quarter of the size of the world's annual economic output, which is $80 trillion roughly. So the amount of money that was required to backstop the system was enormous. The financial system basically had what I can only describe as a heart attack. The financial heart was on the verge of stopping running, and the blood, or the money on which the economy depends, almost stopped running. So that's what's happened. But the point is the financial crisis is still with us. We have almost zero real growth, almost zero real wage growth in most parts of the world. Productivity is flatlined. And if we look at the politics of the world today, it's become very polarized. The politics has become politics dominated to a large extent by populism and by nationalism. And the 3 figures on this slide are sort of a testimony to how bizarre, without trying to take a political view, our politics have become. And this is, I would argue, in large part a reaction to what happened in the financial crisis. So where did it all start? Where did capitalism begin? And I want to sort of suggest that there are three founding pillars of capitalism. The first is Anglo-Dutch mercantilism. Okay, so you can't have capitalism without capital. You can't have capitalism without money. So 1602 was the year that the Dutch East India Company was set up. It was one of the earliest companies in the world. But more to the point, its shares became tradable on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. This was the first time in history that a person could actually buy and sell a share. In 1694, the Bank of England was created, and a year later started issuing banknotes. These are the first permanent banknotes issued in the world. So that was the first pillar for capitalism getting going. The second was the Industrial Revolution, a period of massive technological change which drove some of the profitability that fired the first great age of capitalism. And thirdly, the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment's an important period that was very much the environment in which capitalism was born. And I think the key characteristics I would emphasize there is the Enlightenment was a period when we went from a God-centered mentality to more of a man-centered mentality in the Western world. And moreover, the key concept which dominated life before that period was very much the rule of status. People had rights, people had responsibilities by virtue of their humanity, by virtue of their position in society, whether they had a high or low position. The Enlightenment and capitalism replaced the rule of status with the rule of contract. Your ability to do things was entirely dependent on the contracts you agreed, the economic contracts like employment or buying or selling things in the market economy. So those are very important characteristics of capitalism. And the first great age of capitalism, I would say, was bounded by the years, this is entirely subjective, 1837. Two very important things happened in 1837. One is that Queen Victoria came to the throne. Perhaps the more important thing that happened is the invention of the electronic telegraph, and bounded by 1929. So this is a period of vast technological innovation, huge wealth creation, and through the telegraph and the telephone, the beginnings of real global connectivity. But of course, hubris set in, complacency and arrogance set in. And so the global economy, and particularly the stock markets, the financial markets, started to exhibit the characteristics of an out-of-control cocktail party, essentially, where everyone's drinking way too much, getting way too merry, and someone just keeps on filling up the punch bowl until it all goes horribly wrong. Now, the end of the first age of capitalism, I would just pinpoint a few points here. The first is Karl Marx. Karl Marx understood that one of the very bad side effects of capitalism was that as people moved into urban environments and they became increasingly detached from their family environment, from the church environment that they were used to, people became far more fragile. But there was intense urban squalor that was associated with the first great age of capitalism. And ultimately, it was a degree of social dislocation that couldn't be sustained. So this led to, inevitably, the Russian Revolution in 1917. And the Soviet Union is born. The Soviet Union establishes a completely different model of how to run society, founded on the idea of common ownership of assets and decisions being made by the state rather than by individual people. So to some extent, the Russian Revolution, the spread of Marxism, was part of the crisis that blew up the first great age of capitalism. But its chronological denouement was very much the Wall Street crash of 1929, when just unbelievable amounts of money got destroyed in the world's biggest financial bubble. Now, that's the end of the first cycle. What you then see is an age of protectionism, which I would call an age of protectionism, running from 1929 to 1979. And this was an era in which economic activity in societies became far more highly regulated, far less bottom-up, far more top-down. It's the era of John Maynard Keynes, it's the era of the United Nations, it's the era of increasing taxes, supporting an ever bigger welfare state. It's an era in which, in a sense, people increasingly regarded the state as a kind of psychological mother. But It was a period in which growth stagnated to a large degree. And people who were looking around the planet in the late 1970s would observe fairly high growth in the most free market of economies in the United States, mediocre and unsatisfactory growth in Western Europe that had a mixed model. Some of our business was conducted by private corporations, some by the state. And in the Soviet Union, the communist model, what you saw was extremely low growth indeed, and probably zero growth. So what you then have is the revolution that starts the second great era of capitalist expansion. And this was facilitated by Deng Xiaoping in 1978. Deng Xiaoping was a Chinese leader who actually opened up China to foreign investment. The ability we now have to purchase these incredibly powerful smartphones at an unbelievably low price is entirely down to the fact that Deng Xiaoping allowed Western corporations to manufacture all manner of stuff at dirt cheap prices in the Far East. And then you enter Margaret Thatcher in 1979, who wanted to roll back the frontiers of the state in the UK and turn us into a far more American economy. And of course, then turbocharged by Ronald Reagan's election as US president in 1981. And he very much did more of the same, and he outspent the Russians, which led to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the real beginning of the second age of capitalism, characterized by Canary Wharf and Steve Jobs. Now, this is another pictorial of the second great capitalist boom from 1979 to 2008. Now, there's a whole bunch of technological innovation, very much like the first era of global capitalism. Things like the mobile phone, silicon chips becoming more powerful, the World Wide Web, the human genome. But you also had some more technical, legalistic, financial innovation. And the one thing I want to highlight here is a very obscure thing shaded in orange, which should be orange, called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It's an international trade negotiation round. What did it do? Well, it set up the World Trade Organization, which is fairly interesting to economic nerds like me. But more relevantly, it smashed international tariffs. By tariffs, I mean barriers to trade. I mean taxes on importing and exporting goods globally. By smashing, massively lowering international tariffs, the Uruguay round of the General Agreement Tariff and Trade was able to create a completely level playing field in the world. It meant you could buy or sell things wherever you wanted with almost no frictional costs. And it effectively meant if you were working on a production line building a car for Fiat in Turin, indirectly you were now going to have to compete against the level of wages that you might pay to someone working on a production line in China or Malaysia. So it introduced a competitive explosion of globalization, this second age of capitalism. So again, huge wealth creation, huge economic growth, but what you see in the Far East is a massive build-up of wealth because of this huge offshoring, of manufacturing activity in the Far East. Huge growth in middle-class wealth in the Far East, huge stocks of capital being reinvested in the West, being offered at very cheap rates of interest, leading to a housing bubble, leading to a financial bubble. So just like the first great financial period of capitalist expansion coming to an end with the Wall Street crash, you see a similar thing happening in 2008. But what you also see is this. You see income inequality growing at a very fast rate. Now, this is a rather tedious couple of graphs, but what you can see, particularly on the left-hand side, is the so-called Gini coefficient increasing quite sharply in the big Western economies. Now, the Gini coefficient is a statistical tool to measure how unequal income is. A Gini coefficient of 1 means only one person has all the income in a country. A Gini coefficient of 0 means everyone has the same income. And what you can see is a massive growing of income inequality going on in the West as very much the fruit of the globalizing characteristics of the second great age of capitalist expansion. So going back to the financial crisis and the politics of today, I would say this again reinforces the central tenet of my analysis, which is that capitalism contains the seeds of its own destruction. And the most significant part of this is not the dynamic of a cocktail party getting out of control, although that is definitely part of it. The central problem is the moral and philosophical underpinnings of society as we get richer. Do we care for each other as a society, or as we get richer, do we lose sight of that? And I would say this is, in a nutshell, the Achilles heel of capitalism. Thank you for listening.